Throughout its 4 seasons of the Overwatch 1 era, the Overwatch League had multiple teams go on to vastly surpass their preseason expectations. Many of said teams went on to become pretty special, and they tend to hold a special place in our hearts even if it does come with some embarrassing takes to look back on. Trust me, I'm the king of that. But anyway, I thought today we could look back on some of these specific teams. We'll discuss what their expectations were, the reason behind their low rating, and how they managed to prove everybody wrong. Here are my top 5 teams in Overwatch League history to greatly surpass their expectations, plus a few honorable mentions. Let's get through the ones who barely missed the cut first. One team I nearly added but decided against at the last moment was the 2021 Houston Outlaws. How on earth could I not include them, you know? That's what some people are going to be asking, and it was a tough choice for sure. But hear me out. I admit that they absolutely blasted away most people's expectations. At the time during the preseason, fans and broadcast talent alike tended to rank them outside of the top 10 in the overall standings. If you go back and look, a lot of the most recognizable voices within the community ranked them in like their bottom 5 or 6. Platchat had them 16th, I believe Bren individually had them bottom 3 in NA, and if you count me in this discussion, I had them 17th. The point is, most of us were sleeping on them big time. Even the major Houston Outlaws believers out there likely did not foresee them winning 11 games and nearly making the playoffs. Their tank and support line got tons of criticism at the time, and I give those players a lot of props for playing way better than any of us could have expected, because along with their great record, I think a lot of those guys were just great from an individual standpoint. My honest problem that keeps me from putting them in the top 5 was that shock factor and how it really wore off rather quickly. Yeah, they finished way higher in the standings than we expected them to, but did we really see them beat anybody amazing aside from like a weaker shock team than anticipated and a Dallas team before they hit their stride? They were pretty unclutch for the most part and essentially just beat up on average looking teams. They didn't really go out and shock the world all too much. Their surprise factor came early on, then essentially faded into irrelevance until the end of the season in a close play-in match against the Justice. I feel like they're somewhat forgettable compared to some of the other teams on this list that I absolutely fell in love with. Onto my second honorable mention, I'd like to bring up the 2019 Chengdu Hunters. I don't think I heard a single positive thing about them during the preseason. Some people, like myself, were just ignorant of what China was capable of, while others failed to see how they generally keep up with the competition. Their players were not super hype on paper aside from a few World Cup veterans, and they were fully expected to be below average. What we got instead was a team that managed to do just enough to have a fighting chance to make the playoffs. I'd say that winning 13 games is a lot more than people thought they would at the time, and if that wasn't enough, they surprised in a second way. Their cultural impact on the league is nearly unrivaled. They became the fun team who likes to play ball and DPS into GOATs. Win or loss, people were excited to watch their games. Looking back at it, it's pretty insane to think about because this franchise was expected to be irrelevant in every way you could possibly imagine during 2019, but they went ahead and put on a show. So for that, they absolutely deserve an honorable mention even if they don't quite make the cut, because at the end of the day, I think they more so didn't have high expectations because people didn't know who they were. So it's not really fair. And finally, the last team I wanted to highlight is the 2020 Seoul Dynasty. The problem with why I don't think they make the cut is because they more so surpassed their mid-season expectations rather than the preseason, which is the main thing that I'm basing this on. Seoul out of the gates were anticipated to be pretty decent, most likely a playoff caliber team in fact. Finding them inside the top 10 of a preseason power ranking was fairly common. People believed they were capable as they had stars and reliable veterans alike. The problem was nobody was truly taking them seriously as a title contender, which is where the surpassing expectations definitely comes into this. Making the grand finals and beating the Shanghai Dragons in an upset playoff victory is pretty huge, as well as pushing the shock to their limits if I'm going to be honest with you. But I think the main surprise factor more so comes from how they played during the season. That's my main problem that keeps them from making the top 5. The reason people were doubting them was due to their inconsistency during the regular season before we had any sort of information. It had nothing to do with their preseason opinions. This was a problem they were dealing with in the present. Seoul were super hot and cold. The tank line, it was an absolute nightmare, let's be honest. And the coaching, that was pretty all over the place. That might have been the worst aspect of the entire roster. All of these factors were unknown beforehand. You got to keep that in mind. In fact, the rumor stated that they were looking quite good during the preseason and scrims and whatnot. So in my honest opinion, it was more so the midseason expectations that they surpassed, which is why they cannot qualify for my top 5. I hope that makes sense. Again, I'm not trying to say that Seoul were a super surprising team who proved the haters wrong, because they absolutely were. I just think that the timing is off for this kind of topic. Nothing more, nothing less. Oh, and if I missed any other teams that you think deserve a shout, then throw them down in the comments below, but not for the actual list. At the number 5 spot is going to be the 2021 Paris Eternal. The big issue with Paris was the pure regression that they saw from a roster standpoint during the offseason. Going from Element Mystic to a fully EU roster did lead to a lot of doubts within the community. Some fans, analysts, and notable figures within the community even went as far as saying that they would be last place in the West, and if you didn't have them last, they were likely bottom 3. Naga and Khan, they were definitely exciting pieces, but the confidence overall wasn't there for the entire unit. There was not a ton to like, and I think that's what makes their story so special, as they won us over the hard way. Looking at the bigger picture, they did only win 8 games, which isn't exactly mind-blowing, but I don't think anybody expected them to be anywhere near an even record. The common consensus was a few wins at most. They were supposed to basically be what London and Vancouver ended up becoming. There was no real possibility for them to be a playoff contender like with 2020 Seoul and whatnot. It was a very different vibe overall. It was kind of like the 2019 Chengdu Hunters, but I think people knew more about some of these Paris players than the Chinese region, as EU is just more popular overall, I'd say, here in the West. People were more familiar with these players, and despite some of them being likable, the general consensus was they just weren't going to be that great, as the competition has only gotten greater since the start of the Overwatch League's existence. And that is why it's really cool what they were able to accomplish. To even be in contention to make the playoffs to begin with is mind-blowing, and 8 wins or not, they had a couple of great upsets and close matches with some high-quality rosters that they had no business competing with. Beating both the LA Gladiators and Dallas Fuel is a major achievement for somebody who was supposed to be a punching bag, and you know, a lot of their players became quite respectable. Khan and Naga, they were even better than people thought, but Don was really just the best story of all in my opinion, as he was far more capable than a lot of us could possibly ever imagine. And for the cherry on top, some fans and broadcast talent consider their coach Get Amazed to be a dark horse contender for Coach of the Year. Paris did so much with so little. To be respectable when you had every reason not to just screams excellence from top to bottom. They didn't do anything groundbreaking when it comes to the high stakes matches, but I still feel they deserve to be here since they were rated so incredibly low before the start of the season. Moving on to your number 4 spot, I have the 2018 Boston Uprising. These guys were the OG underdogs that came out of nowhere. Not all of you were watching during this time, so allow for me to set the scene. Out of the 12 teams to take part in the inaugural season, Boston were one of the lowest rated. If I remember correctly, ESPN had them dead last in their preseason power rankings back when they used to cover the league. Additionally, PCGamer.com ranked them 11th, and the Overwatch League and some of its broadcast talent were not thinking of them very highly either during this time. As a result of this initial research, I actually did some more snooping around to see what different publications thought of Boston back in the day, and I came across a quote that I had to include in this video. Here's what a specific writer had to say. "The Uprising are destined to falter throughout much of the season. They need to revisit in next season's free agency and may be the proverbial doormat of the league." From rankings and opinions like these, it's clear that the roster in general was seen as a bunch of nobodies, and this kind of thought process is the exact reason why they had to be included in this video. Despite such low expectations, they won 26 games and got the 3 seed in the playoffs. Although I gotta say, the regret of ranking this team so low during the preseason definitely came into effect way before the end of the regular season. I mean, as soon as Stage 1 hit, people's opinions started to sway as they nearly made the stage playoffs. And then you have their crowning achievement soon after as the only team to have a 10-0 stage in league history, and they were in fact the first ever team to have an undefeated stage in general. And while it often goes overlooked, they did manage to take one set in their best of 3 series against the Philly Fusion in the playoffs. And while the final set in the series wasn't exactly close, technically speaking, the Boston Uprising almost pushed the Philly Fusion Preseason out of the playoffs early, which meant that we would have had a completely different looking playoffs and grand finals. This team blew the minds of everyone, as a good bit of their roster developed into stars when they were supposed to be nobodies. Stryker on his own made any Boston hater sick to their stomach. Dude was a top player in the league, a world-class tracer player, and an MVP candidate if all of that wasn't enough. Then you also have guys like Gamsu and Neko, who were arguably top 5 players at their positions and were elected to the All-Star game alongside Stryker. It's honestly quite impressive. Boston at first were nobodies, but then by stage 3, they were the guys everybody was talking about. From the quote-unquote proverbial doormat to stage 3 title runner-up, who had beaten every team in the league. If that's not transcending the labels that are placed on you, then I don't know what is. If they had won the stage 3 title or maybe their playoff series against the Fusion, I might have even put them a little bit higher on this list. Moving on to the number 3 spot, I'm going with the 2020 Los Angeles Valiant, and it would absolutely not be a list without these guys. The 2020 LA Valiant received similar criticisms to that of last year's Eternal roster, but with even better results. I talked about Paris earlier, but they were technically in the bottom half of the standings with their 8-8 record. Meanwhile, the Valiant went 12-10 and were 8th place overall, not to mention that they automatically qualified for the double elimination portion of the playoffs that year, and that is really good for a team that a majority of the league did not believe in. The Valiant were not supposed to be competitive during 2020 in the slightest. Due to budget issues, management was forced to essentially clean house. Everybody but KSF, Shax, and McGravy got the boot, and you'd have to imagine the only reason those 3 were around still was because of their contracts not being expensive. The new roster was full of unproven talent, maybe aside from DPS and Lastro depending on who you were talking to. Nobody knew what to expect out of like main tank, let's say, and don't even get me started with Rain, because since he came from Florida, people like myself were giving him zero chance. In my eyes, I saw the Valiant being what London were in APAC that year, but even worse. They would be lucky to be better than 19th place. But of course, due to Packington's brilliance as well as the sheer talent of this roster, we immediately start hearing things about them being better than expected. As a result, some people started to rate them a bit higher right before the start of the season. However, most rankings still had them as mediocre or below average, and even if you did buy into the so-called scrim bucks, I don't know if anybody saw them making the playoffs or winning a playoff series for that matter. If you foresaw this outcome using gut instincts alone, then you should hit the lottery immediately. Because wouldn't you have it, the Valiant were competitive. They weren't going to compete for a championship, we all knew that, but they had proven that they could hang in there with most of the teams from North America. They made a few tournaments, they pulled off a few upsets, and were generally enjoyable to watch. They grew on depressed Valiant fans like myself very fast. This franchise did so much to have an impact on the league. They had multiple stars, including a superstar level talent in Kai. And how about Packington? He surely was considered to be in that Coach of the Year conversation for how much he accomplished with that team. And honestly, I think the crowning achievement that we have to talk about the most is the fact that they won a playoff game against a respectable team like the Florida Mayhem. Think about that for a second. The roster that had the lowest expectations for the franchise up until that point, not including 2021, was the one to give the Valiant their first playoff win ever. Pretty crazy, right? To say they surmounted what the general fanbase thought they were capable of is an understatement. The 2020 Valiant are a must-have in any sort of discussion that involves this specific topic. Third place is well deserved. Rolling into the number 2 spot is the 2021 Atlanta Reign, and this one is weird because everywhere I look online, nobody really had them rated like painfully below average. I myself thought they'd be mediocre at best, but I guess that was just the unpopular opinion at the time because some people had them even in their top 10. At the same time though, I highly doubt that anybody saw them becoming an absolute powerhouse, and that's my big reason why they make this ranking. Even if you bought into the scrim hype or really liked their general roster, is there even a single soul out there who had an unbiased prediction of them appearing in the grand finals and arguably being the best team in North America? I doubt it. Here's why. Even if you liked their roster, it was hard to say they were at the level of like the common consensus title contenders like the Gladiators, Shock, and Dallas Fuel. Maybe they could make the playoffs, but they felt like gatekeepers. After a disappointing 2020 campaign, the level of faith in the tank and support lines definitely took a hit. But more than anything else, the coaching had been receiving a lot of criticism for the terrible job they had been doing. And when you combine all those factors, it seems like it would be impossible for them to be a true contender. And yet here they were, playing with absolute confidence after the first month. And what makes it especially scary is that they just got better and better and better. Pelican asserted his dominance, and the other team members essentially followed close behind. The unreal improvement in flexibility and consistency from people like Gator and Masa, as well as Iris, led to some incredible results. To this day, I still cannot comprehend the fact that not a single Atlanta player received a Role Star award. It is mind-blowing. But of course, the players weren't the only aspect that improved, as the coaching definitely took a major jump after picking up Unter as an assistant. 2021 saw the Reign just win and win some more. Making Hawaii 3 times in a row and qualifying for the playoffs automatically is proof of their hard work. That on its own likely meant that the Reign had surpassed a majority of their expectations, but the Reign weren't done yet, because that playoff run that they had is one of the most magical to date. They could literally defeat any team in the league except for the Shanghai Dragons. You think that any Atlanta simp out there thought they'd be that ridiculous? I doubt it. The Reign established rivalries with all of the best teams in the West, and they beat them all. The sheer dominance on rush and double shield comps was a sight to behold. It was enough to bring a tear to your eye with how great their teamwork and individual heroics were. From preseason gatekeeper and potential low seed playoff team or worse to grand finals runner-ups. If that's not a ridiculous jump ahead of established limitations in place, then I don't know what is. And finally, the number 1 spot on the list goes to the 2020 Paris Eternal. Yes, another Paris team made the cut, and maybe that's boring or undeserved to some of you, but the truth is, Paris are really good at owning the doubters. The other Paris team, aka the 2021 roster, was expected to be worse, but this variant achieved so much more, which is why I do end up ranking them higher. Some people are quick to forget that Paris were commonly ranked outside of the top 10 in 2020, and I'll be the first to say that I did not foresee Paris being competitive, and if you look back at Plat Chat or other popular figures, they thought the same way. 15th place or worse was a fairly common prediction. Some people were believers, no doubt, but it's highly unlikely that even the biggest Paris believers out there thought that they'd play as well as they did. The thing with Paris was, we knew they had talent. Sparkle, he was the number 1 sought-after rookie during this time, and he brought along Rush, Hanbin, and even Exy. The problem was, well, everywhere else, maybe aside from Soon. I know that I am not the only one out there who had little faith in Ben Best, Gray, Hip, or Nico. Even main support was not guaranteed to be a success. I saw a team divided. They had clear-cut carries with some of their new potential rookies, but also people who just weren't impressive back in 2019. Paris were not supposed to be a contender, but that's exactly what they'd end up becoming, which is why they so greatly surpassed their preseason expectations when they were supposed to be like bottom feeders, essentially. They became the very thing that seemed unattainable, and the crazy thing about it was it happened immediately. They didn't slowly progress. Paris had a hot start where they showed they were not to be taken lightly when they beat the Fusion and took them to a map 5 in a different series. And from there, they had another streak of dominance during the summer when Genji became the meta, and this includes both the Summer Showdown and Countdown Cup. To sum it up, Paris had multiple MVP and Rookie of the Year caliber players with a top 4 record in the league and a Summer Showdown first place finish. And I think that Summer Showdown run by itself gets them into this conversation because that was a legendary weekend where they proved that no team in the West was safe. They competed with and took down 2 teams who made the Final 4 of the playoffs, including the Grand Finals champions. That is no easy feat at all, and they deserve so much credit. I mean, even to this day, it still sends shivers down my spine what they were able to accomplish. And they were so special. So many likable personalities, so many superstars, an amazing DPS line, the crazy story of Fielder being a god on high ping. They had so much going for themselves. It was stuff of legend. The 2020 Paris Eternal didn't just surpass their limitations, they completely annihilated them. They essentially finished 8+ places higher than where most people were ranking them in the preseason power rankings. That is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, how do you do that? That makes them one of the craziest and most amazing blow-up/underdog stories this league is ever going to know. I've gone on long enough about this subject though, I think you kind of get it by now, so that's a good place to end the video. But that does not mean that the conversation has to end. I'm sure that plenty of you watching have differing opinions, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on what teams you thought vastly surpassed expectations down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this content, hitting like and subscribe would help me out so much. And as always, thank you all so much for watching my videos, I appreciate your support so much, and until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.